Good morning, everyone. I'm Mark Swartz, Executive Director of Law Center for Better Housing, or LCBH. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us this morning in person and online on the Zoom. I'd like to extend a special thank you to the many city, county, and state elected officials that we see signed up. I'd also like to thank the circuit court judges and other court staff who are with us, as well as the folks from the Illinois Housing Development Authority. Thank you all for your interest in this work and all that you do for tenants. This morning, our moderator and panelists will discuss the dramatic changes to the Chicago eviction courts since the pandemic began. Each of them brings a unique and thoughtful perspective to a topic we all care deeply about, making eviction court more equitable. Law Center for Better Housing has served Chicago's low and moderate income renters for more than 40 years. In that time, we've seen just how important it is for renters to have access to free legal and other stabilizing resources in eviction court. In 2019, LCBH launched our Evictions data portal. We now have a full decade's worth of data that we share with the public. Over this time, we found that an average of 22,500 households are evicted every year in Chicago. While the eviction moratorium helped to reduce that number, at this time, eviction filing rates are back to pre-pandemic levels. The data portal demonstrated a vast imbalance in rates of representation between landlords and tenants, with only 11% of tenants being represented, while 81% of landlords are represented. And it goes without saying that when a renter is represented, they're much more likely to obtain a positive outcome in eviction court. Before COVID, the eviction process moved very quickly. Tenants had as little as 7 days between receiving the eviction summons and going to trial. Even where a renter obtained counsel, courts were not connected to rental assistance, leaving little time to apply for these resources. In 2020, Cook County government and the Circuit Court of Cook County, in partnership with the Chicago Bar Foundation, and local legal aid agencies, created the Early Resolution Program, or the ERP. And I'd like to thank the members of the Chicago Bar Foundation who are here, and Samir Nazim, who's on the panel, who sort of started the ball rolling at the CBF, and then the staff that are here today that have kept the ball rolling, as well as Chief Judge Evans' office, the representatives from the Chief Judge's office signed on. We'd like to thank everyone for being here and helping create this vital resource for renters in eviction court. Through the ERP, renters and landlords now have access to court-based emergency rental assistance, free attorneys, and mediation on their first court date instead of going directly to trial. In July of 2022, the Department of Housing chose LCBH to lead its Right to Counsel pilot project. And thank you to DOH and to Commissioner Navarro for supporting Right to Counsel in Chicago. And we're very excited. It's a year on the Right to Counsel program. And we have many of our partners here. Legal Aid Chicago has a contingent here. They're partners on the Right to Counsel, as well as Carpels. This 3-year initiative connects the ERP and provides the next steps for free legal assistance to renters. So if an eligible renter doesn't settle their case in the Early Resolution Program, Right to Counsel funding allows LCBH or its partners to provide extended representation in eviction court. Recent legislative changes at the county and city level also support Right to Counsel and the project of making eviction court more equitable. In 2020, the Chicago Fair Notice Ordinance codified a renter's one-time right to cure, giving renters a right to pay their landlord even after an eviction case is filed. This, combined with source of income protections, gives tenants a right to use the court-based rental assistance that has become abundantly available in eviction court during and after the pandemic. You may be wondering who is benefiting from these changes, and I think that's best answered through the story of an actual Right to Counsel client. James, a 75-year-old renter, was facing homelessness when he was referred to LCBH. LCBH supervisory attorney Ryan Moran, who is here, secured a dismissal of an unfair eviction, and James remains stably housed. Please turn your attention to the screen to hear more about the importance of eviction prevention to renters like James.
My name is James, 2019. The house authority called me and had me an apartment ready over there. So I moved on Lake Street. It was okay. So I go out the next day, get my mail, I see an eviction notice. What the hell this come from? And so I go back to the manager's office, ask them. They said, no, we didn't get served no eviction notice. I said, how did I get in my mailbox then? And they couldn't explain it. And that's when I started calling for legal advice.
My name is Ryan Moran, and I am a supervising attorney. James had received an eviction notice from his landlord in December of 2019 for a lease violation, so something other than non-payment of rent. When the case got to court, he agreed to move out, and this was right before COVID hit. So he didn't move out, and the court case didn't proceed because the courts were closed for 6-7 months. During that period of time, he continued to stay in his apartment. Nothing happened. In February of 2023, his landlord filed a motion with the court to let them know that he hadn't moved out like he had agreed, and asking the court to make him move out. However, during the 3 years between when he agreed to move out and when they brought the case back to court, he had done a number of things. He had paid all of his rent, he had signed a new lease, and he and his landlord had actually filed for rental assistance from the city to help with paying the back rent. And all of those things constitute what we call waiver under the law. So we accepted his case, and then we filed a motion to bring to the court's attention that he had paid all that rent and done all those things, signed the new lease. And so the court agreed with us and said that he could stay.
She did a damn good job. I put it like that. I was all choked up when the judge said he almost favored Mr. Jenkins. But that made me feel damn good.
Having stable housing is kind of the foundation for a good life. For me, helping somebody keep their home or limiting any negative impacts from having to move is about helping to stabilize those families and communities.
At this time, I'd like to pass it over to our moderator, Connie Wright. Connie is joining us from Atlanta, Georgia, where she is the Senior Vice President for Housing Access, Affordability, and Community Impact Philanthropy at the Wells Fargo Foundation. Wells Fargo has made an immense philanthropic investment in housing justice through the Keeping People Housed grants since the start of the pandemic. Connie currently manages an expansive grant portfolio of more than 40 nonprofits with a focus on providing housing counseling and legal assistance for low and moderate income renters and homeowners. Thank you for being here, Connie.
Good morning. Connie Wright. I, again, am with Wells Fargo, part of the Housing Access and Affordability Philanthropy team for the Wells Fargo Foundation. Really thrilled to be here today. Since the pandemic, I have been charged with managing a coalition of HUD intermediaries to help renters and homeowners avoid eviction, a coalition or cohort of legal assistance nonprofits to help low and very low tenants avoid eviction. And we piloted last year a program where we are looking to address issues around tangled titles and heirs property. So all about keeping people housed. The panel today, along with myself, are really thrilled to be here and address and share the work that you have done here in Chicago. Given that I have managed over around 25 legal assistance nonprofits throughout the country, both urban, suburban, and rural, I can help validate that the work that you all are doing here in Chicago is really leading in the industry. I believe that LCBH was identified as a best practitioner for the work that they are doing. And once I met all of the panelists earlier, it was clear to me why the work that you are doing does lead. So the panelists that we have here today, I would like for each of them to briefly share their name, their title, organization, and why you do this work.
I guess I'll start since she's looking directly at me. My name is Denerica Brooks. I'm the director of the Housing Practice Group at Legal Aid Chicago. I have been doing this work primarily because housing specifically, housing stability, housing safety are both foundational and fundamental. And I think that we forget that sometimes. We forget, how can we expect someone to go to work and be able to focus when they were up all night because they were heating their home with a stove, or because someone doesn't have a place to lay their head, because their children can't sleep because they're couch surfing from day to day. We forget what that looks like in the community investment piece when people are unstably housed, or we have unsafe housing that has mold, that has lead, that has conditions. And we forget just how traumatizing evictions can be, not just on individuals and families, but also on the communities that people reside in. So for those reasons, it's really important for me, my personal experience, my background, to try to do everything that I can to try to provide for some stable housing, or at least an opportunity to have safe and stable housing wherever you live in city or Cook County, because we should have it. It helps us to be better people, helps us to have better and healthier communities.
So I'm Michelle Gilbert. I'm Law and Policy Director at the Law Center for Better Housing. And I'm very excited to be in a room with people that I've only seen through Zoom over the last 3 years. So when I became an attorney, I actually worked at an excellent private firm for a couple of years. And I knew immediately that that's not where I belonged. And I went to legal aid, and I've been a legal aid attorney now for 33 years. And I do it because I grew up in a community on the south side of Peoria that was blackbusted in the early 70s. And my parents didn't move. So I grew up in what everyone else in Peoria thought was the black neighborhood. And it just imbued me with this sense of racial justice that it's just been part of me since I was a little girl. And I knew from just going to eviction court, and that sense is supported by all of the data, that eviction is a race justice issue. And I know we'll talk about that more. But I just knew that preventing eviction was what I was meant to do coming up from that experience as a young girl.
Good morning. My name is Daniel Kahertz. I'm Director of Policy Research and Legislative Affairs at the Chicago Department of Housing. And I think the short version is I, as an individual, and DOH as an institution, believe that housing is a human right, quality, safe, healthy housing. More personally, my mom was actually a tenant organizer for part of my childhood, so I grew up hearing stories of, how important housing and how precarious housing could be in Chicago. Also, just growing up in the city, and I was starting in middle school. I went to a school that had students from all over the city, and I started going all over the city to for birthday parties and just to hang out, and it's impossible to do that without noticing, different parts of the city are very different, and to start asking, well, wait a minute, why is that? And I think that's part of what has led me to this, and to to the sense that there's what we all know in this room is there's a lot of work to be done to have housing justice in Chicago.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Samira Nazem. I'm a principal court management consultant with the National Center for State Courts, where I lead our eviction diversion work, where we work with court systems across the country and trying to implement versions of what's happening in Chicago and other state and local courts. I began my legal career as a legal aid attorney first at Denerica's organization and then at Michelle's organization, and it is an honor to be on a panel with these pillars of our legal community. But back when I did eviction defense work, it was hard not to notice that for every tenant we represented in court, there were 9 or maybe 99 who weren't represented and were having terrible outcomes and going through a really demoralizing, dehumanizing process. And it was obvious that courts can either remove barriers to accessing legal services or inadvertently create barriers to accessing legal services. And I left practice to work with courts to think more about how we can try to create holistic problem-solving models that make it easier for landlords and tenants engaging with this system to get the supports and services they need, and to make our courts better places for resolving disputes and promoting housing and financial stability.
Excellent, Samira. Thank you. Okay, down here. So I will wrap up this portion of the presentations today. We talked each of them about why they are doing the work. And I will just end by saying, for myself personally, I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama in the 60s. Low wealth community and household, single parent, all that you hear about. And frankly did not see as much in terms of housing instability. But I remained, as I continued to work and become an adult, committed to the work to help to address the issues, the various issues that individuals face in low income communities throughout the country. As the work evolved with Wells Fargo over these 34 years, I ended up in a place where I had the opportunity to be responsive and impactful relative to the pandemic. And so much of the work that I'm doing today was established back in 2020, March of 2020. The legal aid nonprofit cohort was new to Wells Fargo, and to our knowledge, one of the first of its kind. And so we very clearly saw the impact and opportunity to make a difference, and I am blessed to be able to say that I have been charged to do that work. Many of us cannot often say that we love what we do, but in fact I do, and so thrilled to be here today to learn and to listen and to share. And so with that, why don't we go to our first question. This question is going to be for all of the panelists. What changes have you seen in eviction court since the pandemic started? Denerica?
Well, I'm going to start with a people first response, because the people are who we're here to serve and who we're here to help, and I think it's important to keep them in mind when we're talking about anything that we do. And I think the main thing that I've seen is when people come to us through the ERP program or through our program, they've essentially come to us because they've hit a wall. They've hit a wall with their resources, they've hit a wall with their time, their ability to actually do things, but also their mental health. And I think that we forget about that sometimes. Like, we're just getting through a pandemic and we are not over it yet. There were people that lost family, they lost friends, they lost loved ones. There are people who had COVID themselves and didn't know whether or not they would survive. People are not okay. So when we see people, we're seeing individuals who have high anxiety, they have depression, it's hard to get tasks done that should be done. And the people that we are seeing are those that don't have a lot of resources. Like, think about yourself and what happened to you during the pandemic. Maybe you had health insurance. Maybe you had a friend that could refer you to a therapist or someone that you can talk to, or at least a network to point you in the right direction to get help. And a lot of people don't have that. So they've been trying to navigate this space alone. So when they get to us, they are hurting. They're probably more, and I am not a medical professional, but there are people that are exhibiting a lot more symptoms of anxiety, depression, and just really having a difficult time making it day to day. And those are the people that we're seeing in our program. Those are the people at risk of being displaced by eviction. Those are the people that don't know where to turn or what to do, or have given up hope because it seems like everything has given up on them. So just that's what I've seen.
So I think about our systems change. That, you know, as Mark talked about, and I won't go over it, how eviction court used to be this point where the trial would last for very little time. People didn't have time to prepare. And too often, people would come to our office, walk in with a piece of paper and say that they needed help with their eviction case. And what they were showing me was actually the eviction judgment. And I would say, well, you had your trial. And they said, well, it was just a minute or two. And I said, well, yes, you've had your trial. And we would coach people through the central screening unit. We would coach people on how to ask for a continuance. And I would say, don't say anything about your case. Just keep saying over and over again, I need 7 days. And in Cook County, we have institutionalized an automatic continuance so that people have time to consult with an attorney. And we put those attorneys right there in Zoom so that people can move from the court Zoom to the ERP Zoom and actually talk to someone who can explain to them the process. And somebody asked me once, where's this space? Where's a thing that I do where I'm most myself? And I said that moment in it, and I was thinking in person, of course, that moment in the intake interview when I can reach over and say, I got this. I've done this before. Because you're talking to someone who hasn't done it before. And I can say, I've been there. And so trying to get people to court. We used to, how do we get people to legal aid? Well, they're going to court. So we're just going to put legal aid in court. And, they're right there. We encourage people. Our Right to Counsel project does not have a new phone number. We're not out messaging. Oh, call us. Thank you, Grace. That's particularly because she knows I talk a lot. Okay, Daniel.
One of the things that I am most excited about is that we have court-based rental assistance now. We can actually provide financial assistance to cover all or pretty nearly all of somebody's rental arrears if that's why they found themselves in eviction court. And it's been an evolution. That's a pandemic era change, but it's been an evolution. I mean, we at DOH actually launched our first rental assistance program during the pandemic in April of 2020. We basically found ourselves at home. It may shock you or not shock you to hear that the city was not prepared for people to work from home. And so we found ourselves, all of our programs were shut down. We said, what do people need? We threw this together. And I remember sitting on my couch after we had opened the first round of rental assistance. We only had enough money to give $1,000 to 2,000 households. And I remember looking at we had an online application. I remember just sitting on my couch in the evening and seeing the application numbers click up to eventually 83,000 people applied for 2,000 grants. And this was only April of 2020. And so I'm really happy to say that we've gone from that extremely rearguard, thrown together application to in October of 2021, we were able to partner with the county and IDA and ERP and the Bar Foundation, many others in this room, to launch a court-based system where you can actually have direct intake and get someone to help you fill out a application in court. Right, and that's not only great for the tenants. It's also means that the landlords can get made whole as well, and it also dovetails with what Mark mentioned at the beginning, which is a law that was passed in 2020, establishing the right to cure.
Right, and I work with court systems across the country, and everywhere it's a version of what you've heard all of my panelists describe. People are in crisis, they're traumatized, they need help, they don't know how to get help. And I think we've seen this opportunity for courts to think really creatively about how they can play a role in better connecting people with services. For a long time, there was this conventional wisdom that by the time you go to court, it's too late to really do much. But as Michelle said, our messaging has really shifted, and now it's come to court. When you come to court, you can get access to services. It may be legal aid, it may be rental assistance, but this isn't the same experience you may have had previously. We're thinking much more strategically about how courts can serve as this point of connection, and when people are in crisis and they need as few barriers as possible to getting help, courts can play a role in eliminating barriers and helping to make those points of connection more impactful and effective.
Thank you. One thing that I would want to point out, or actually two. I said earlier that the work that you all are doing here in Chicago really does lead in the country. First, that you were able to deploy funds quickly in April, I think I heard. There are some states that, believe it or not, did not use their funds and had to give it back. And I'm sure that many of you knew that. Inexcusable, really. But kudos to Chicago and the state for doing really great work proactively. And the other thing that I will echo is around individuals that are in crisis. I work a great deal with HUD counseling agencies, many of them working with those that are facing foreclosures. Can't tell you the number of them that would say, finally, after numerous efforts to reach them, they come in with a bag, a plastic bag full of unopened notices. And in many cases, it's too late to do that work. That is what we saw very consistently in 2018 for the housing crisis. And so outreach is key. Clearly, you all are doing that well, and to be able to reach people where they are. So you'll hear more about that as we move through the panel today. So for question 3, Denerica, as the director of the Housing Practice Group at Legal Aid Chicago, your team works on all types of housing justice issues. In your experience, what are the harms of eviction? Who is most impacted?
The harms are trauma, the trauma of actually being evicted, the trauma of displacement, the trauma on communities of having people leave the community or being, shifted around or moving from community to community. I mean, that's one of the harms. The harm goes to the children of the majority Black women who are being evicted, who now not only have this trauma, but studies, and this is science, not me, this is studies that are showing that there are poor educational outcomes for children who are evicted in their lifetime. For the job loss, the lack of income in a community, because you have to be able to get to work. When you don't have stable housing, that can be a challenge, that can be difficult. Those are the people that are being really harmed. So you're traumatizing individuals, you're traumatizing families, you're traumatizing children, you're creating a feeling of hopelessness within families, because when you get to court or when you get that eviction notice, it's too late. There's nothing that I can do. And you're putting strains on the community, on emergency rooms, on other social service safety nets, because there's no other options. And this disproportionately falls on people of color. We know that in the city of Chicago. It's not that folks in Lakeview or in River North don't get eviction notices. They just experience grace in a way that people in Austin and South Shore and on the South Side don't get the benefit of having.
Thank you for that, Denerica. Moving on to Samira. You have had extensive legal aid experience as a staff attorney and pro bono coordinator. You recently, more recently, you've worked with organizations that partner with the courts and the legal community to make the justice system fairer and more equitable. I can speak to Samira's work. Personally, we have worked over the last couple of years on a $20 million strategy activated by the National Center for State Courts on a really forward-thinking eviction diversion initiative. And I can see now where the work that you guys are doing here in Chicago helped to form or frame out that strategy. So to that end, what is the court's role in preventing eviction, and does this impact their neutrality?
Thank you, Connie. And it's a great question, and I think it's something where the thinking on this has evolved a lot over the last several years. Courts have to be impartial, but that doesn't mean they have to be uninvolved. And I think that's kind of a nuance that has been lost for too long, and COVID has really created an opportunity to rethink the role of courts and how they can maintain that neutrality while also being good partners with organizations like all of these on stage. And we have seen that COVID has created this window for courts to stop operating in silos, but to start working collaboratively with legal service providers, rental assistance providers. We see courts now that are embedding social workers on site, because when people come to court, they don't just have that immediate legal issue, they have a lot of other interrelated human and legal needs as well. And courts are really trying to shift so that they can address the holistic needs of a person when they come into the court system. And that's been an incredible opportunity that we've seen take off during COVID. And again, none of this impacts their ability to resolve issues that need to be resolved by a judge, but it allows them to create an opportunity to leverage the existing service providers in their community and to help facilitate those referrals while still maintaining their impartiality and neutrality to resolve legal disputes that come before them.
Yeah. Again, best practice there. What I have seen throughout the country is many municipalities and jurisdictions don't have this strategy. It seems like a no-brainer, if you will. But there are many that are trying to develop this strategy, or those that have not yet determined or seen that it is a best practice. And so an event like this today, valuable to be able to lift up the best practices, a validation of the work, again, that you are doing here. Michelle, in your role at LCBH, you are LCBH's legal and policy director. Your team works on both new eviction diversion programs that Mark mentioned earlier. Please describe for our guests here at Impact House and those watching on Zoom, how does the Chicago Right to Counsel pilot program enhance the Cook County Early Resolution Program? How have both helped to address the possible post-pandemic eviction tsunami?
So the early resolution program is really the universal access. And one thing I'll say about how it operates in Chicago is that it is available to modest income landlords who don't have access to counsel, as well as to tenants who come into court without counsel. Of course, we just talk to the tenants, but, and the goal of ERP, obviously, early resolution program, is to try to get in and work out a settlement. And sometimes it absolutely works because people come in, tenants come in knowing what they want to do, or maybe they've even spoken a little bit with their landlord. But in most cases, the landlords and tenants haven't talked. I mean, I get that. It's hard to talk to somebody that you owe money to, or they don't really know what their options are. So very much, we're spending time in early resolution explaining the process. Again, we've been there before, and often the tenant hasn't. So the ability to, what we just say, to hold on to the case and consider them part of our right to counsel client community is to extend the representation so that once the case is beyond that early phase, we can still work on negotiating a settlement. And preliminarily, about half of the cases we keep and work all the way until there's a settlement that's approved by the court. And then in some of the other cases, we actually file motions and get cases dismissed. So knowing that, honestly, that Deneric and I are the end of the road. You're either going to agree with early resolution program or we're going to file an appearance, right? And, we file motions. We enforce the rights that tenants have in eviction court.
Really, thank you for that response. And another thing that I will point out is in many parts of the country, the landlords are not at the table still, even through the pandemic, surprisingly so. And so there's that adversarial relationship and time wasted in trying to get them convinced to have them get to the table. And so again, to be able to do that early on was a win, and I think speaks to the reason why in many cases the current eviction rates are higher than pre-pandemic rates, but not so here in Chicago. And I believe it was because of the fertile ground that was the great work that has been established up to this point. So now, as a grant maker, I would just say supporting legal aid providers in many different jurisdictions, Wells Fargo has seen a lot of creative programs, utilizing scarce resources to help keep renters housed during and after the pandemic. Legal aid is essential. What we know is that in instances where tenants do have legal representation, they are far more likely to have a positive outcome. So relative to that, this question is going to be for Daniel and Samira. Day to day, how does court-based emergency rental assistance and free legal aid increase access to justice for renters in eviction court? How is right to counsel in eviction court beneficial to landlords?
Well, I can certainly speak to the first part. I think one of the things that's honestly been a learning for me is how powerful these pieces are combined so much more than they are separate, right? So when you have access to a lawyer and extended representation, as Michelle said, it means that you have the ability to, somebody who can enforce your rights, but then you also need the substantive rights and you need the ability, to fulfill them. And one of them I started mentioning at the end of my last answer is, this right to cure, right? So it used to be prior to 2020, you had 5 days, right? And once you got to court, basically you could come up with all your back rent and the landlord could still legally say, nope, you're out. And now they can't do that, right? And not only can they not do that, but you have access through court-based rental assistance to the funds that you need to actually make that the case, to come current on your rent. And so the combination of that substantive right and the fair notice law, the court-based rental assistance actually providing the funds, and then the representation saying, hey, this is your right, and I'm going to, work to enforce that in court. That is, really together so much more powerful than it could be, any one of those pieces would be separately.
Sure, and I'll kind of respond to the second part about how programs like this benefit landlords and housing providers as well. A well-functioning court system benefits everyone, the plaintiffs, the defendants, the community as a whole. And so when we see programs like this or the eviction diversion programs we work with at National Center, we're creating a court system that can reach better outcomes for everyone, and that benefits the housing providers and the tenants. What we want to do is find ways to resolve issues in a long-term sustainable way so that these cases don't just come back to court over and over again because we're not reaching outcomes that can keep tenants stably housed in the long term. And investing this time into cases, slowing down the process a little bit so people have an opportunity to speak with a lawyer, to apply for rental assistance, to access social services, can create better long-term outcomes that will promote financial and housing stability for the entire community and hopefully stop this kind of churn in this cycle of eviction where we see repeat filings over and over again. I do also just want to call out the Chicago program because it is unique in this model because there are legal services available for small landlords as well. I think we see in Chicago around 20% of those small landlords don't have counsel, and they're also struggling to navigate this process and to understand how to pay their bills as well. And it's important to think about how these programs can benefit everyone and how we can create a stronger ecosystem for resolving issues in a more sustainable way by thinking holistically about the needs of all community members.
Thank you, Samira. Daniel. As the Director of Policy Research and Legal Affairs at the Chicago Department of Housing, you help to shape department's most impactful policies and programs. One example is the Right to Counsel pilot project. I know that the pilot has just recently started, but I'm sure you and Michelle have some concrete ideas for how you will know whether it's impactful. That is really key as we continue to move forward and look to address the housing crisis created by the pandemic. If you hope to be able to get additional funding and revenue, you want to be able to speak to outcomes and impact. I know that as a funder, that is really quite important to us. The demand is greater, funding not so much. And so it is important that you're able to articulate that. So for Daniel and Michelle, how are eviction diversion programs like the Right to Counsel pilot evaluated? What data is being tracked?
Yeah, so that is absolutely a really core part, and as we were shaping and sort of conceiving of the Right to Counsel pilot program, we really wanted to make that integrated from the start and really think of it as a true pilot, right? So as I think was said, this was launched sort of mid last year. It's $8 million over 3 years, funded actually by the Federal Emergency Rental Assistance Program through a sort of 10% set aside called the Housing Stabilization Service dollars. And it is a pilot, right? We only have funding for the 3 years. That's how far the grant goes out. And so from the beginning, we worked with the Polk Brothers Foundation, who very generously contributed funds to support a formal evaluation with Stout, which is a Chicago-based but work nationally organization that's done right to counsel evaluations in cities around the country. And so I'm sure Michelle can talk about this more, but essentially we just want to know, what are the options, the outcomes that are possible for a case? What does the tenant want the outcome to be? Because they don't always want to stay, right? Sometimes the relationship has been so poisoned, or what have you. And then what are the actual outcomes versus what do we see for folks who don't get legal services? But Michelle, I'm sure you can speak more to that.
Well, I mean, it's a very good point. As lawyers, our goal is to achieve the client's goal. Like I always say to clients, I don't have a vote in this. I just I try to do what you want me to. So we do have evaluation questions as part of the intake, as part of closing the cases. So we are looking at, output. Of course, we want to be efficient. I think the way that we're operating this is more efficient, where you have housing attorneys who are going to eviction court, and not like in the old days when I would go from a Social Security case to a divorce case to an eviction case. So we have people who are very focused on doing this area of law. We're very coordinated. We meet every other week, and we share. Somebody gets a good brief, we share that, or information that we have about different cases. So we're looking at the outputs, the outcomes for the clients, and the client's perception of justice. We're saying, did you have technology to participate in remote court? Did you, what do you think would have happened if you hadn't had access to an attorney to consult with? So kind of a lot of evaluation questions that people probably would not have thought of. But fortunately, Stout has done this in other places. So, they knew what to ask. One of the things that's kind of interesting is how many people come into eviction court with and identify that they have some problem with conditions. And at least a third of clients, can we address that in the case? But also, take that same information and use it as policy as well. Like we should address conditions problems because those cause people not to pay their rent, which lead them to be in eviction court. So we want to use the data for policy planning as well as to continuing the right to counsel.
Thank you. So after Daenerika answers the next question, we're going to move to questions in the audience or virtually, I believe. So for you, Daenerika, eviction rates are back to and sometimes surpassing their pre-pandemic levels. Talked about that earlier. In some cases, higher. What will happen if programs like court-based emergency rental assistance and free legal aid are no longer available?
That's a really good question. I do want to clarify, though, eviction filings are at their pre-pandemic levels, not eviction enforcement. And in fact, we know that the program is working because the sheriff's office is not enforcing as many evictions as they were pre-COVID. So we know that. But what I do think that we're in trouble if there isn't any more court-based rental assistance or ERP programs. And I say that for a couple of reasons. First, our court system was broken, and we knew that. Everybody knew it. No one wanted to acknowledge it until everyone was at risk. When it was just the black and brown people at risk, then no one really cared. So I hope that this is not performative. But we do know that these programs work. And these programs are not just for tenants. That's the other things, as Samira alluded to before. These programs are for everyone. Landlords can avail themselves of court-based rental assistance and legal aid attorneys as well. And when we think about the big picture, what that means is when we can actually resolve these cases through settlement and amicably, you have stably housed tenants, you have landlords, especially the small mom and pop landlords that are more likely to rent to black and brown folks within their community, still able to. And when they can use their own property to create housing and create income, that's creating generational wealth for those small mom and pop. So it helps everyone. It helps the tenants remain stable. It helps the landlords create generational wealth for their families, which is something historically folks have been locked out of in the past because of redlining and other historic policies in this city. So not having this program would just erode away at the gains that we are making, when I would dare say that right now we are fixing systemic issues through this program for both tenants and landlords.
Thank you for that. You know, the piece around what we wanted to really look at over this pandemic housing crisis, the difference between mom and pop landlords and your larger multifamily developers. And so I'm glad to hear you point out the interaction and outcomes with the mom and pop, because they are a larger percentage really throughout the country of those that are providing housing. And many of them could be in a position to help communities and households build wealth, generational wealth. And so thank you for pointing that out. And again, it is something that I think we need to keep on the radar as we move forward. So with that, oh, and the other thing that I will say is funding. That is something that we'll need to keep our eyes on as this crisis begins to evolve. You know, when we think about those individuals that are now facing homelessness, that were not able to access state or federal funding, and where do they land? And so Wells Fargo does depend on strategies and key stakeholders and the work that you do to help inform the work that we do. Much of the funding that we have deployed since the pandemic, over $40 million, over 400,000 individuals assisted, was used to hire staffing to address the demand. And so that funding piece will remain, obviously, it is always funding, right? But it will remain a key element in this work. Okay, so from the audience, and this one is going to be for Daniel. The eligibility and application process for rental assistance can be confusing. What would you like renters and social service providers to know about rental assistance?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it can be a little bit confusing, especially because certainly at the height of the pandemic, but continuing on, there are multiple programs, right? So DOH has a court-based rental assistance program. The Department of Family and Support Services has their own rental assistance program, which actually predates the pandemic, which has its own set of requirements. And then, of course, you know, there's overlapping programs from the state and from the county. So I think, you know, what I would want people to know, most of all, is that if you live in the city of Chicago, and you have an eviction filing, you can get connected to court-based rental assistance by going to court, right? Through the ERP program, you can be connected to that. And we are fortunate that that our funding source is the federal ERAP, Emergency Rental Assistance Program, because it has pretty flexible requirements. You really just need to be a resident of the city of Chicago, have experienced some kind of hardship, and have income below 80% of area median income, which is a relatively high bar for these type of programs. So I think chances are, if you have an eviction filing, you go to eviction court, and that's what you need. You need rental assistance. You'll get connected, and you'll have a very good shot of getting it.
And the outreach component of that is really important, is it not?
Yes, and that's something we're still looking, still thinking about. How do we do more of? How do we, do more education and engagement in earlier phases, when we were doing assistance not only through courts but also had more funding broadly. And I should say that we've done a significant amount of, I think at this point we're up to well over 2,000 households that have been helped through court-based rental assistance. But we also more broadly had rental assistance that had general applications. We've, since the beginning of the pandemic, DOH has supported over 30,000 households with more than $170 million of rental assistance. And during those phases, one of the things we were really intentional about doing was funding not just a central online portal to apply, but also funding a whole network of community-based organizations to fan out and spread the news in their own communities, and especially in communities where maybe there is not a lot of trust in government and not a lot of faith that I can type my information into this government website and they'll help me, right? And but I do know this organization that has an office on my corner, and I trust the person who tells me I can do this.
Thank you, Daniel. So,
I just want to say
go ahead.
very quickly, for anyone who is looking at Zoom, we're going to put the link in the chat for the Illinois Housing Development Authority, which just since the beginning of July is working on court-based for the city of Chicago. So, and the item materials are, as always, excellent. And if you're here in the room and you need a link to that, well, then you can just talk to us later. But anyone who needs to know about rental assistance, there'll be that link, as well as the link to the Cook County Legal Aid and Housing and Debt Program, which is the long name for what we do in ERP, as well as some other things. And that can link people to rental assistance as well.
thank you.
We actually got more in from the chat.
Okay. So let's see. This one is for Denerica and Michelle. Since the start of the pandemic, landlords have been hurting. Talked about that. What would you like landlords to know about rental assistance and right to counsel?
Okay, so I've said this throughout the pandemic, that there has to be another way. If you think that your only tool is to evict people, then that's what you're going to go to. But with the eviction moratorium, we realized that there were other solutions. And rental assistance actually gets money in your pocket. Getting an eviction order does not. That gets you an empty apartment and a piece of paper, right, that maybe you can enforce and maybe not. So, I've said this so many times, that rental assistance is for tenants, but we can't think of it as only that way. The check, in 90-something% of the times, the check goes to the landlord. And then the landlord can pay what's owed or go to Home Depot, but keep that money in the community. And that's why we need to continue rental assistance, because it's not just a program that helps tenants. That would be enough for me, but it is really a community development program. It gets money into communities, so.
Ditto. And just communicate. I mean, right to counsel is really an opportunity for everyone to become aware of their rights and to make informed choices about what to do. That goes for landlords as well. So if there's some way that we could get everyone a little bit of something so that no one feels like they're at a total loss, that's what we want to do. So engage in the process, engage with us, engage with our programs, because we're really out there to try to help communities. It's just that we work specifically with tenants.
For the both of you, as a follow-up, have you seen an increase in a willingness for the mom and pop landlords to engage and look for, this mediation process? Have you seen that increase over time? I know that early on, there were some, I don't want to go through the lengthy process of getting approved for the federal funding, or some, I don't want to accept help for, as you might imagine, in certain regions of the country. Have you seen an improvement, an increase?
I think it's kind of all over the board. I will say that it is easier for two lawyers to talk than it is for a lawyer and someone who has a personal investment, whether the landlord or the tenant. So, landlord, you may think, it's much better if my lawyer just goes in and the tenant isn't represented. But, lawyer, it's like working out a divorce sometimes. Like, the lawyers can do it better than the individuals.
And then I think the other piece, I say this sometimes, principals are expensive and not everyone can afford them. So if you can like move away from like the principle of the matter and being upset and being hurt and actually talk about what the end goal is, you can get so much done and have an honest conversation about what needs to happen, what needs to be done. Maybe this tenancy is not sustainable. This is not a good fit. It's no longer working out. It's best that we move to separating, have the tenant move out and be able to work towards doing that. Maybe the landlord gets some money in the interim that happens, but really just having a conversation like what can we do so that we can get out of our feelings. And Michelle's absolutely right. When two people are mad and angry at each other, you're not hearing what the other person is saying. So it's almost like a mediation. What I hear you saying is, this is important to you, and try to work around that and the end goal as opposed to being upset because you feel disrespected or slighted.
Thank you. So along that same line, Michelle, are most clients living in corporate buildings as opposed to smaller mom and pop?
I mean, we have everything in Chicago. You know, big buildings. We have your 2 and 4 flats. So, and I don't know who is more likely to be evicted. I do believe, I don't want to repeat myself, but I do believe though, when the landlord has access to some legal advice or when they have a lawyer, you know, we can work it out. I mean, it's what lawyers do. Add this layer of, I don't know, dispassion, which is probably not how people perceive me. But you know, when I'm trying to settle a case, I'm really just trying to settle it.
Got it. Daniel, is there any court-based emergency assistance for folks living in Cook County?
In suburban Cook, yes. Yes is the short answer. There's court-based programs in the city, in suburban Cook, and in counties across the state, actually, that IDA and DHS have helped to set up. So that's that's also, I would say, a really exciting partnership that really has been true from the beginning of the pandemic, that the city, DOH, Illinois Housing Development Authority, Department of Human Services, DHS at the state, and the county have all been working really hand in hand to make sure that we are rolling out these programs in a coordinated way, sharing information, and that's been incredibly powerful, and I don't think we would have been able to do nearly as much as we have without that.
Got it. Mark and Daniel mentioned right to cure as a new policy that strengthens right to counsel. Can you elaborate on it?
Yeah, it is essentially it is the right to cure your back rent, to say that, okay, you're a tenant, you're in eviction court because you have not paid some amount of rent. Previously, by the time you got to court, even if you had all of that back rent, plus late fees, plus whatever else, the landlord had the right legally to refuse it and to continue with the eviction. And now, as of the Fair Notice Ordinance in 2020, there is a one-time right to pay that. And so, again, especially with rental assistance, even if the landlord does not agree to participate in the application process, and we have to go through with a tenant, the tenant gets the check or the tenant gets funds some other way, they can show up in court and say, I have all of the money, the landlord is legally obligated to take this, at least one time. And that's a big change and obviously makes it a much more powerful program.
Thank you. How are we doing, Bell Lady, in terms of time?
I think we are actually doing pretty good.
Awesome. So I have one more question from the audience and then a final question for the panel. So, Michelle, have you been successful in obtaining relocation assistance for tenants being evicted in Chicago? There is relocation assistance outside of Cook County. Are there advances in Chicago?
So there are ways that rental assistance can be used to help with relocation. Especially the way that IDA is administering it now, which is a little bit different. But so the federal rental assistance can cover 15 months and then 3 months going forward. So sometimes that ends up paying rent to this landlord while the tenant is working on moving. There are other rental assistance programs as well, the state homeless prevention funds. No problem layering those two kinds of assistance. If someone has a new landlord lined up who'll do the state homeless prevention funds application, right now it's a little in fiscal year transition, but it'll be up again soon, that can go to the prospective landlord. I mean, I don't want to paint a rosy picture. Relocation is very expensive. And so, you know, I know that tenants need funds for that, but we are able to work. Both of our legal aid organizations have social, you know, supportive services that can help with locating assistance.
Thank you. So I was just given another question that they think is really important for us to ask. And this is for you as well, Michelle. Lately, landlords are saying tenants can have no evictions on their records. Does a prior eviction effectively blacklist a tenant? What can be done to address this?
So it's an excellent question. Does a former eviction, which we know substantially is going to happen to a black person, does it blacklist someone?
Can we not use the word blacklist?
So I would say that it is not illegal to ask about prior evictions. I definitely think, pass this over to Daenerys in a second, that it does have, clearly, as we've been talking about, it has a disproportionate impact on the basis of race. To say I will not take anyone who has been to eviction court. I'm just going to quickly say, though, when we were in COVID, we recognized that, hey, people who look like lawmakers, they were at risk of eviction, so we sealed all those records. The law has gone back to what it was pre-pandemic, and we need to change that. And we work to seal any record we can, but the law needs to be a little bit more favorable. But I'm going to pass it on to Daenerys to talk about disproportionate impact.
I don't have enough time to tell you what I think about this because, I mean, the reality is it's not an actual eviction order that causes people to be barred or blocked out of housing. It is the eviction filing, meaning that as long as an eviction is filed against you, even if you win, even if you didn't know about it because you didn't, and then you didn't go to court, you were defaulted, the filing itself leads you to be essentially barred from opportunity areas, and some landlords that have blanket policies that they won't even look at you or let you apply if you have an eviction filing on your record. And you know what that does? It opens the door for landlords now to threaten tenants with the filing of an eviction if they don't get their way. So now it's a tool for harassment and abuse and other systemic injustices. So yes, that eviction filing is very harmful for people on their records, which is why I think a lot of people will try to move out before an eviction case is filed, but the landlord will still file the eviction anyway, and then sometimes the tenant doesn't even know about it. So you can win. It could be because no fault at all. Maybe the landlord wants to move in. Maybe it's a new owner that came in and they want to rehab the property or do something. Maybe your lease just expired. An eviction filing looks the same regardless of the underlying reason for having the eviction filed against you. And that is going to disproportionately affect people like me that look like me.
Tough answer there. Okay, so with that, why don't we then transition to our final question? And this will be for the entire panel. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought more attention to eviction than ever in your career. What do you hope will be the lasting lesson policy change? What do you hope will be the lasting lesson, policy change, or other impact? Starting with you, Daenerys.
Oh, I have my rose-colored glasses on this morning. I would say that we don't have to do things the way that we did them in the past. We don't have to be tied to those systems. We don't have to be tied to the way that the court operates, the adversarial nature. We can envision something different. We envision the our ERP program, where people could get together and try to resolve their legal issues and differences in an amicable way, in a way that actually benefits both parties. We can look at other systems and do that. We see that it works. We know that it works. We have the data that it works. So let's keep looking at our systems so that we can actually give people an opportunity to avail themselves of the rights that we say that they have. And even if they lose, guess what? You lose some, you win some, but as long as you have enough information to make an informed decision, how empowering is that to have a choice and to be able to make a choice about your own life and your own family's life? Let's look at it differently.
Thank you. Michelle?
So I'm going to go to a system change again. Right to counsel was an issue that existed pre-pandemic, but again, the threat of so many evictions, evictions for people who look like friends of my son because they're young in their career, it really accelerated the interest in people having access to counsel. I mean, not only in jurisdictions like New York that already had right to counsel, it accelerated the expansion of the program. We saw additional jurisdictions adopt right to counsel. We got Detroit, we got Toledo, we got New Orleans, we got St. Louis. There are a lot of cities that now have right to counsel, and I want Chicago to be on that list. I am very heartened to see that it is in our new Mayor Johnson's transition plan, and so I'm hoping that that's a permanent change that we see adopted by City Council. All the funding is very important. Obviously, you can't do it without the funding, but we need a written law that we can go back and say tenants in Chicago have a right to legal representation.
Michelle stole mine, but yeah, I mean, I think I would summarize, and Derek too. I think I would summarize it as just we can do this. You know, I mean, this is all of these are things that people were talking about and needed and were fighting for before the pandemic. And the pandemic gave us, you know, it kind of gave us it feels perverse to say this, but it kind of gave us a shortcut to actually executing and building some of it. You know, the Right to Counsel pilot program, we didn't have to fight during the budget season to get that. We just got this emergency rental assistance grant from the federal government. We're like, we're putting out an RFP. And now, you know, it's going to go through 2025. And as Michelle said, a mayor was elected whose platform included, and now transition plan includes, making that a permanent program. And, you know, when budget season this year or next year, certainly by 2025, you know, we can go and say, look, we've been having this impact. This has been lifting people up for the last 2.5 years. Are we really going to go back? And I think it's going to be really, really hard to answer, yes, we're going to go back.
And just to add on to what everyone else has said, especially Generica, we don't have to go back to how the courts operated before, where it felt kind of like a conveyor belt that was just steering people to the inevitable eviction judgment. We can stop that. We can build an intentional process that is deliberately trying to create every opportunity to avoid eviction and displacement, to leverage all of these incredible programs and resources. What we see here and across the country is the best eviction diversion programs are multifaceted. They're drawing on all of the different community partners and services to make sure that everyone is getting the right service and resources they need to be stable. If landlords and tenants are not monolithic groups, we don't need to think about them as monolithic groups. We need to make sure that we are meeting people where they're at and getting them the right legal, non-legal, financial, social supports so that they can leave court in a stronger place than where they entered it. And we can really create courts that are focused on solving problems and not enhancing existing ones.
Thank you all. You know, Samira, I think about recently a conversation that we had about one municipality that really rather conceded eviction, but rather wanted to build up their strategy around how do we help them post-eviction. And so just know that there are some municipalities, cities that are in that place. But in the case, again, here in Chicago and Cook County, I would say lean in to the work that you have done. I tend to be a girl, glass half full. And one thing that I do say often is the pandemic did provide more of a willingness and an opening for us to be able to pursue impactful ways to help people avoid eviction. We know that before the pandemic, there was this issue with evictions. Matthew Desmond really highlighted the plight and the issues that we faced within this country. But we have seen greater progress because of that willingness to address this issue during the pandemic. And so after hearing the panelists today, I feel even more encouraged and to say lean in. You have great success, an ongoing proactive approach to keeping people housed. And so I will look forward to tracking you all and through LCBH, having them help us to lift up the best practices nationally for the cohort that we are currently managing or administering a grant program for. So with that, we are at the end of our panel today. So on behalf of the Law Center for Better Housing, I want to thank you and all of you virtually and in person for joining us today. Before we depart, I want to thank Impact House Chicago for hosting the event. A big thanks also to Tim Frakes and his team for making it possible to share this event to over 300 guests throughout the country and to watch it on Zoom. And finally, thank you to all of the panelists for the great work that you're doing, the meaningful work that you're doing, and for volunteers for making this gathering possible. So please join me in giving our panelists a hand.